Good evening, and welcome to another forum. We have another special treat this evening. About a dozen years ago, Bob Putnam, who has been with this faculty for a long time, wrote a book that really awakened people. It was called Bowling Alone, and it addressed the issues of social isolation in the country, the degree to which people were no longer participating in group activities such as bowling. And there's been a lot of concern since then about that phenomenon. And tonight we're here to talk about, as a foundation for our conversations, a new book, fresh book. It comes back and takes a look at where we are now and how people in three areas of our life, and politics, and business, and religion, are responding to this new world in which we find ourselves. And some people are finding ways to connect in unusual and interesting ways. Since we have a panel here of three authors, co-authors, unusual to have three co-authors on a popular book called Applebee's America, and you will find it, I'm sure, just up the street in many places, and probably very soon you're going to find it in some of your courses. Applebee's America, How Successful Political, Business, and Religious Leaders Connect with the New American Community. Now, what's very unusual about these three authors is that one is a Democratic strategist, one is a Republican strategist, both have been highly successful in their fields, and the third is a neutral journalist who has distinguished himself with the Associated Press, and has also been here at the Institute of Politics as a fellow, where he did a lot of the important foundational work for this book. So the book's just come out, and we're here tonight to talk with the authors and to have two other people from the faculty of the university who know a good deal about business and religion in particular, and the moderator is supposed to know something about politics. But in any event, to have a conversation about this. Let me introduce the panel to you, and then we'll turn to Ron Fournier to give us an overview of the book, and we'll begin the conversation. To my immediate left is Mary Jo Bain, and I hope that most of you know Mary Jo. She has become the academic dean this year, probably something she did not seek, and if probably wish she had never said yes to. She should have taken a Sherman way back when. But she is also the Thornton Bradshaw Professor of Public Policy and Management here at the Kennedy School. She has worked in distinguished positions in government she was Assistant Secretary of Children and Families at HHS during the early Clinton years. And she was also the Commissioner of the New York State Department of Social Services during the 90s. She had enormous experience. But most recently, interestingly enough, among the many things she's written, most recently she wrote a book which she was co-authored entitled Taking Faith Seriously. She's a Catholic who has thought a great deal about the direction of the Catholic Church as well as religion more generally. To her left is Matthew Dowd, who is the founding partner of Via Novo. It's an international management and communications consulting firm. He is better known, perhaps, for his past work as a chief campaign strategist for the Bush-Cheney ticket in the year 2004. He oversaw all of the campaign's media, message development, targeting, and research, a subject that we wish to pursue in just a moment. Prior to that, he had been a senior advisor to the Republican National Committee, director of polling and media planning for the 2000 Bush presidential campaign. He is the co-author of this book, one of the three co-authors. To his left is Ron Fournier, who is a former chief political writer and White House correspondent for the Associated Press, three-time winner of the Merriman Smith Award, a major award among White House correspondents. Began his journalistic career in Arkansas, where he covered at the time a little-known governor named Bill Clinton. I never knew whether Bill Clinton was scared of him or whether he just wanted to keep his distance because he was always his Ron call jet, and because he always knew that Ron got the story, which was not easy necessarily. He's co-author and editor-in-chief of HotSoup.com and was extraordinarily popular here when he was in the IOP as a fellow. To his left is Rosabeth Moss Kenner, someone I again hope is familiar to you, and if you have a chance to go to the business school to take courses, I recommend you look her up. She's the earnest Arbuckle Professor of Business at the Business School. She specializes in strategy, innovation, and leadership for change. She has guided leaders for some 25 years. I always tell the story of being in Davos, the World Economic Forum, at a luncheon with about 50 CEOs who are looking for guidance about how to guide their corporations, walking into the room, 50 males sitting around the table hearing from Elizabeth. It was wonderful. She loved it. And because she has, all these men were at her feet trying to understand where they should go. She has written many, many books. She's a former editor of the Harvard Business Review, and she has been named to various lists of the 50 most powerful women in the world. And she's a great friend of this school, by the way. Doug Zosnick is sitting to her left. Doug served for 6 years as senior advisor to President Clinton, one of President Clinton's favorites there. He played a key role in policy, strategy, political and communications decisions at that White House. During the 1996 presidential re-election campaign, he was the White House political director, and of course that was a successful campaign too. So we have two very successful political strategists. He has also served as chief of staff to Senator Dodd from Connecticut, currently advises U.S. corporations. This is what I like, the National Basketball Association, where do we sign up for tickets, and U.S. Senate and governors and who are in crisis, and with regard to crisis management. And he is another of the co-authors. Big panel. We'll try to go through quickly. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes up here, and then we will go to the floor and invite your questions. So Ron, tell us, Applebee's America.
Here we go.
What are we talking about?
Before I get into the highlights of the book, I just want to say that when we started talking about how we were going to get out across the country and talk to people about this book, this was the first place we knew we needed to go. We had to build the rest of our trip around here. The book got started here. It would not have happened without a lot of hard work by a lot of researchers, some of whom I see in the audience, Paloma and Josh. Just incredible work. Bob Putnam not only turned me on to this whole idea of connectedness and the decline in social capital and the potential for an increase, but he gave me a lot of his time and advice just on how to organize and write a book. And for that, I'll always be grateful. When I came here in the winter of '05, the three of us had just decided to write this book. And had just gotten back from Applebee's, which was our first sojourn to try to figure out if this was one of the companies we might want to focus on. And at the time, we were going to do a book about change, how the country was changing, and how political and business leaders might be able to learn from each other. And the book really evolved right here. The first thing to happen, and if some of you might remember, if you go back and look at the study group notes, it literally was just business and politics. And largely, the big change we were focusing on, about the only one at the time, was exurbia, the fast-growing parts of the country. Well, what happened here, first of all, was a guy named Rick Warren came right here and gave a remarkable speech and spoke to two classes, both of which I attended. And I was blown away at this guy who obviously knew as much, if not more, about how to connect with people here, how to talk to people in the way people now get their messages, and how to get a sense of community, how to help people connect with one another, than any politician I had been around, except for maybe Bill Clinton, and probably better than most businessmen. This was a marketer. This was a man who was selling the Word of God. So I dropped these guys an email that night and said, we have a third leg of our stool. It's megachurches. And right away they recognized that was going to have to be where we went. So what we did, we started focusing, I mean myself, the two of us, and the researchers here, on how these leaders, the best among us, the best leaders in any entity, are adapting to the changes that people are making. And people are changing where they live, both the sprawl I mentioned, the internal migration, and with the great immigration in this country. They're changing how they live. There was a resetting of priorities in this country, personal priorities, in the mid to late 1990s that was accelerated after 9/11. We talk about that in the book. You can talk about it here. They're changing how they communicate. Technologies have just really transformed where we're getting our information from and to whom we pass on information that we want spread. There's a dramatic change in who we turn to for advice. There is a new era, a new rise of opinion leader in this country, and probably at least 10 or 20% of the folks in this room would qualify whether or not you have a title or not, and whether or not you're over the age of 21. Lastly, the other big one that we really focused in on is that people are changing where and how they connect. There is a redefinition of a community out there. And we discovered many threads that these three entities, church leaders, religious leaders, business leaders, that they're successful, the threads that were common among them. One, what we call gut values, that these folks know how to connect here first, before the head. That Bill Clinton knows that it's the value of empathy was the most valuable thing he had, and his policies were a way to reflect that value. George Bush knew that strong and steady leadership in the 2004 re-election was a value. That leadership trait was a value, and his policies were to reflect that value, even if it was a policy like Iraq that most of the people disagreed with him on. Rick Warren, Howard Schultz of Starbucks realized that community, giving people a sense of purpose, to be a part of something, even if it's just part of a diner or a coffee shop, is a value that is actually more important than the product they serve. The other thing that runs between, the thread that runs between is what we call navigators. Is these leaders who recognize and study how to find that 10% of the population, maybe 15% of the population, who are the most influential among us. The PTA presidents, the homemaker, the senator, the firemen, the people out there, because they have a large social network and they're trusted by the people around them. They're the ones in a word-of-mouth world, and we are in a word-of-mouth world now. They're the ones who help people navigate the stormy present, as we call it, that with all this information that's out there now, and with the decline in faith we have in the old opinion leaders, the old institutions, political endorsements, endorsement or an advertisement from a CEO, even your local preacher. As there's a decline in faith in those institutions, we're now turning to each other, to a neighbor, to a friend, to a coworker. Hey, what car should I buy? Where's a good neighborhood to go? What's the best third-grade teacher for my kid? Lastly, the last thing that we highlighted in the book, among many, is that these leaders all disregard conventional wisdom, or at least look at it with a skeptical light. We bust a lot of myths in this book. And one of them that maybe Matthew will talk about later is this idea that the electorate is polarized. Matthew helped run a campaign that was famous for realizing that only 7, maybe 6% of the population were ticket splitters. Therefore, you had to go after your base. Well, we actually found out, Matthew digging deep into the numbers, that there is a huge disenchanted middle. A lot of people out there, although they may be voting straight tickets, aren't happy with the party they're in, and they're ready to break away if the right person, the right message comes along. So that's the themes we highlighted, and we try to pull it together in a form that will help us put our kids through college.
Great. Thank you. Let me come back to this. Now, you started out by studying people in the exurbs. Tell us essentially what the exurbs are, how many people live there, how do you define exurbs? That's a phrase that may not be totally familiar to some here.
What exurb is, one thing we try to do is actually put a hard definition on it. We realized that was silly. In general, what an exurb is, these fast-growing areas outside of a major city that were not there 10 or 15 years ago. There are places like 24 Mile Road in Detroit that was a farm 10 years ago, where you have a neighborhood of people who are new to the neighborhood, where you have the huge swaths of strangers who are disconnected and literally pulled up from the roots. You see these places; they all look alike anywhere you go in the country. There's a big box store, a Best Buy or one of those stores. There's probably a mega church, and there may be an Applebee's.
The interesting thing I think about exurbs that I think is very different than the urban areas and to a large degree the suburbs is people don't move there for a job or they don't move there for some specific reason. They move there because they can get a piece of land and they can get a house cheaper and they can have a decent house and go to a decent school. And then the jobs come to there, the stores come to there. So people's residences, they start with their residences in exurbs as opposed to an urban area where you have a factory and people move, or a suburban area with office buildings and people move there. People start with a residence and everything else from that flows, which is why so much of what these churches and businesses do have to drive from the fact of that initial decision as opposed from people's decisions being driven from the fact of a business decision.
Right. And Matthew, how many people live there?
I think the last numbers I saw was something like 18 to 20% of people live in the exurbs now.
18,
Well, think of it this way. Up until about 20 years ago, in our entire history of our country, people moved to cities. They moved to cities for opportunities. But for the first time now, we're seeing a depopulation of our country. We're only using around 3 or 4% of the land mass in our country. And so what's happening is increasingly now, for a variety of reasons, which we talk about in the book, people, whether you call it an exurb, a metropolis, whatever you want to call it, we are moving away from our urban areas increasingly and moving to new communities. And these new communities don't have a natural core. And so successful businesses, churches, are creating what in the old days may have been a town hall or a labor hall in which they're providing a service to the community of a gathering place for people to get to know their neighbors.
I think one of the interesting things that's going on, too, is this movement isn't static. It's not one-directional. So when people realize, since people are moving there primarily for a life choice in how they want to live, now there are beginning to be 22-year-olds that basically say, that where they are in an exurb, for some reason, doesn't reflect their lifestyle. They are now moving back to the cities because they feel like that city better reflects their lifestyle, more whatever it is, tolerance, or whatever those things happen to be. So this is not, it's interesting, it's not a static movement. It's not like, okay, I understand the exurbs, now I got America. This is their constant movement, but different than years before, it's all driven by lifestyle choices.
Yeah, well, now let me come to this, because let's talk about the politics of this for a moment, and then turn to the business and church-related implications. I think it was 2004. You can correct me, when you had such a big influence on the Bush campaign. As I recall, if you looked at the 100 fastest-growing counties in the country, population growth, George W. Bush won 97 of them. Mm-hmm. It was remarkable. Now, you have a section in this book which I find really, I had not read this story as well told as it is here, about what you did in that campaign in this new environment to connect with people through the Bush campaign, and especially on lifestyle issues and a lot relating to lifestyle choices. Can you tell us?
Sure.
About that?
One of the things, it's interesting that we actually started planning, and I actually started planning before the president was inaugurated the first time. I had written the first memo about the re-election before he got inaugurated in January 20th, 2000, on what we needed to start looking at for 2004, which sort of tells you about how much we had thought about this. And one of the things we noticed was, or one of the things we started realizing, was that as before, people understood people's associations from a political perspective. People would associate Democrat or people would associate Republican. They'd live in certain precincts, and therefore we'd target them or try to find them in that way. Well, what we realized, especially in the exurb areas, that people, as I said, people are making the first decision that's the most important decision to them is their lifestyle thing. What church they're going to belong to, what school their kids go to, what sports they participate in, magazines they subscribe to. And interestingly, the old model had a model of, okay, we understand what issues people are for, therefore that leads them to a party, and therefore that leads them to a candidate. That was always, okay, somebody where they are on abortion or the war or the economy, it gets them to a party, it gets them to a candidate. What it is today, to a lot of people in exurbs, which I think is very dangerous, and we can talk about for Republicans, to assume that the exurbs are there and they're always going to be there, is people make a lifestyle choice, and then they find a candidate that reflects that lifestyle choice. This is what I care about, and I find a candidate reflect. And then that candidate happens to be in a party, and then that party happens to stand for issues. So there's a lot of people in exurbs that they adopt an issue set in the aftermath of a lifestyle, a candidate, and a party. They say, okay, I'm a Republican, therefore I must be for tax cuts, and I must be for the Iraq War, and I must do this. They don't arrive there first. They arrive there as they become part of a team, reflected in their lifestyle. So what we did is we found out all the different lifestyle characteristics that businesses have understood for years that we now applied to a political model. So I think on average we had about 190 pieces of information on voters that we had. And that was from what magazines they subscribed to, what kind of car they drove, did they drive a truck, what size home did they live in, how often did they shop at REI, did they subscribe to Victoria's Secret?
And you knew this about individual voters?
Individual voters.
Had 190 pieces of information?
Average about 190 pieces.
About individual voters.
On individual voters. And then you match that up with a voter file where you then have how often they vote, what primaries they vote in and all that. And what you do is you model off of that. And so as the book states, because lifestyle choices are so important and because they're so important to understand, especially in the exurbs, that we could then put out 16, 18 different models of different types of potential Bush voters or Republicans based upon groupings of lifestyle. So if somebody had a certain magazine subscription and drove a truck and whatever, and even if they lived in a Democratic area, you could go and have somebody go knock on their door and give them a piece of literature about taxes or education or whatever. They could live in the most Democratic precinct. They would have been ignored in every other election. And instead of somebody going to 20 doors, you can go send them to 2 doors because you know that person, based upon sort of lifestyle choices that they had, that they are likely to be a voter if they go out and vote. That was one part of it. The other part of it was reflected in the television advertising that we did, because we were able to find out the partisan viewing patterns of television shows. And so instead of us putting money into shows, the Oprah show, which has a high Democratic index, or Wheel of Fortune, which actually has, or Court TV, which has high Democratic index, we could buy CSI, or we could buy the History Channel, or we could buy, surprisingly, Will and Grace, which had a huge index for Republican women, which surprised a lot of people. We would buy college football instead of NBA games. We would buy certain sports in the Olympics that skewed more Republican or more swing versus other sports in the Olympics. Because everything we want to do is, one of the things we learned is Democrats have an inherent advantage on television watching patterns. And actually, Democrats watch more news than Republicans. This old thing about, okay, we're going to go buy the news, we're going to go put a television spot next to the news. It actually, one, for Republicans, you hit less people than you want to hit. Two, if a political spot airs, and we tested this, airs during a news spot or around a news adjacency, the credibility of that spot drops. Because people's radar go up and go, bing, bing, political spot news, I see the difference. As opposed to a political spot airing during a Boston Red Sox game or whatever that case happens to be. And so we came to that conclusion, one of the things we came to, and every decision that we came to tactically drove from that, understanding people's lifestyles. And then, as Ron said, we could have a whole discussion about navigators, how we recruited 6 million people or so to basically help deliver our message. And we found out the navigators, what shows they watched. And so we were more concerned, interestingly enough, about how to affect the 10 to 15% of people that tell the rest of America how to vote, where to shop, what to buy, whatever that case may be, than we were about talking to 122 million Americans.
Really interesting. And a lot of this became possible because of the availability of consumer information.
Without technology and without the availability, both the availability of information and technology, which provides much faster ways to analyze, recruit, and analyze, research, and then change what you're doing. Without those two things, you would not have been able to do this.
By the way, they bought their data or used a firm who has a member on the board is Wesley Clark, a Democrat.
Yeah, the firm that we used for our life targeting analysis, Wesley Clark was the.
Here's why life targeting works. You have a 30-year-old man in Virginia who in 2004 voted Democratic. It's the third time he's voted Democratic. He's a member of a union. He's blue collar. He's struggling, barely hanging on. 2008 comes around. If you do things the old way, the way the Democrats have always done it, and the way the Republicans did it until last time, in 2008 you're going to assume that's a Democrat. If you're a Republican operative, you're not going to even try to touch him. But now what if you know that since 2004 he got married, he bought a van, had a child, and his wife had to move out to the exurbs. Oh, and by the way, they attend a megachurch. If you know those things, and you can get them from Wes Clark's law firm, Wes Clark's data mining firm, you know that maybe he's not a Republican, but he might be if we go after him.
I want to move to business in just a second, but go ahead, Doug.
I asked David if he wanted me to talk about what we did on the Kerry campaign. He said not to bother.
Yeah, but what about Democrats? Are they going to pick up on this?
Hold on. But I think we all probably can believe that Republicans do watch the news less.
That's because we like objectivity.
Just the one point, semi-serious point I wanted to make, is that, though, if you think about it, American Express knows every single thing about you from the moment you put your card in anywhere. It's kind of ironic that the federal government wasn't able to protect our borders and be able to go cross-reference between a guy that was picked up once and then comes across a Canadian border. But the most important thing is that businesses have been doing this data mining for years and years and years.
And churches.
And technology in the last 10 years has hit a whole new sort of plateau our ability to do things. And so what we found was quite interesting is you're now seeing the merging. The political guys are finally figuring out what the business guys have been doing. These megachurch guys are taking the best of both worlds and combining them. And so what we found, and part of the whole point of our book is that to be successful, no matter whether you're selling hamburgers, trying to get people to go to your church, or whether you're trying to get someone to vote for you, they have the same strategies, which Ron talked about earlier, in terms of understanding how to connect to people in their gut, understanding how the country and the world has changed. But they also, the successful ones also are the ones that are able to harness this technology now and take this information and be able to achieve their goals with that. And that's why, if you think back to Walmart, I'm getting dangerous now, I'm getting into your area. But if you compare 15 years ago to Kmart and Walmart, and why Walmart's where they are today and why Kmart's not where Walmart is today, a lot of that had to do with Walmart's belief in the importance of having a strong back room, and building up a computer system where they understood inventories, understood how to operate in real time, more like a political campaign. And so what we're finding is the world is changing, is that what it takes to be successful in the business world, the political world, and the world of religion have much more in common than being dissimilar. And that's the whole underlying thesis of our book.
Rosebeth, knowing you, I'm sure you have at least 5 things to say right off the bat. Share at least 3 of them.
Yeah, at least. First of all, Mary Jo and I are the bookends on their book tour, so it's a privilege to be here with you guys. Let me go back to a few things you've said, because I think that many of the trends you identify are there, but they've been there for a long time, and I'd like to get a little bit of history in here, because this question of the excerpts and suddenly they're being discovered and they're the fastest growing, there has been a utopian impulse throughout American history that talks about getting back to the land, and that has been responsible for a lot of political divides. I think it goes back to Aesop's fable. I call it country mouse, city mouse, that the country mouse is trying to escape a set of problems that the Democrats have been identified with, and we might not need the rest of the fancy analysis. It might be as simple as that. Secondly, on the megachurches and their techniques, yes, we've been studying that at Harvard Business School for a long time. We've had cases on service management that deal with those churches. Sure, they're the same techniques. The more you guys in your book surface the techniques, and that it's one-to-one marketing, and it's using technology to target lifestyle choices, which of course marketers have known, that actually may create its own backlash. Because the other point you make, which I think is important, has to do with values and the gut and so forth, and that is a rising movement. Increasingly, Rick Warren talks about the purpose-driven this and that, and so do businesses increasingly as their only way to connect. And when you talk about purpose and values, you're actually talking about something a lot larger than lifestyle choices that divide people. You're talking about something that connects people. So my confusion in reading your book that I hope you'll clear up is, are you talking about a new service ethic and a desire to connect and be part of a wider community and feel that I'm acting on my values? Or are you talking about, boy, I want to get away from the city and I have to have my van and I've got a particular lifestyle that involves guns, and therefore I don't want anything to do with the rest of the people? Which is it? Well, is it one-to-one marketing and we're individuals, or is it that we are increasingly longing for a sense of being joined in a community?
I think that the interesting thing is it's both. And what happened is because of what's gone on, we identify what people's movements, people's patterns, and technology, and what's happened in the media. What's happened is that people became more and more isolated. They became more and more individuals, and many people had a prediction that as people were able to access the internet, find their own cable channel, listen to a radio show, they'd become more self-reliant, more independent, and they would not be dependent on other people, and they would not need that. In reality, what happened is that as that happened, people then lost a sense of community, lost a sense of connectedness, lost a sense of authenticity of what they were doing. It became all manufactured. And what people have now done, it's not over the last 2 years, over the last 15 years, are striving for that. And they're striving for that in very different ways than their parents and grandparents did. That's why they go to a megachurch. People don't go to a megachurch initially, most people in the excerpt, is because they want to sort of, they're Bible thumpers or whatever, which is one of the things we identify in this book, that the idea that megachurches are some home of conservative Republicans. They go to megachurches because they want a sense of community and they want a sense of belonging. They go to Applebee's restaurant because there are local heroes on the walls where somebody, it's like Cheers, where somebody knows their name. They go to Starbucks because they can go into a Starbucks, they might see a friend, and so instead of living in the home that they feel isolated and they're watching the television, they want that sense of community, they want that sense of authenticity, but they're not going to join the Kiwanis Club, they're not going to participate in the political structures that the both parties have offered them.
They are forming tribes, aren't they?
But they are forming tribes around the country. So I think it's both.
Same phenomenon, different names, different labels, different forms it's taking, same phenomenon.
Well, Roosevelt, when Ron talked about Starbucks and what they have done with that. Everybody now talks about, it's not the coffee they're selling the lifestyle. The coffee is maybe pretty interchangeable with a lot of other things, but the lifestyle sense that you have from Starbucks has communicated something to people that's made it wildly popular.
It's an awfully big group, then, to call it a tribe. There isn't a Starbucks tribe. They don't want to be a niche. They want to be big. Therefore, they want generic values. They want generic experiences that many people connect to. So it's a different variant of mass. It isn't this totally personalized. And it's fake emotion in many of those places.
Well, I think I found somebody I don't want to get in an argument with.
Hey, that's the nicest thing you've said to me all day.
But if it all boils down to a city mouse and a country mouse, I think I could go to Harvard Business School then. Let me answer your question this way. I think a lot of people left the city to get away from all of that, to get their big house, get their minivan. But I think a lot of people after 4, 5, or 8 years found they were missing things in their life, and they wanted more. And one way you can tell what people want is the kind of housing that they choose. And people who build houses like to build houses for people who want to buy houses. And if you look at what the houses looked like in these new communities 15, 20 years ago, they were gated, they had no front porch, they had no sidewalk in front, they wanted to go in those front doors and shut that door and be away from everybody. And what's happening now in the houses, first of all, there's a great room. I'm old enough that when I was growing up, there was no such thing as a great room.
They were just good.
But what's happened is, if you look at how houses are built and communities are built now, they have sidewalks, they have mixed-use places for restaurants and places for people to go. And the reason they're built is because that's what people want. And so you're seeing that, yes, I have a bigger house, but I don't know my neighbors. I used to know my neighbors, and it didn't used to be so much traffic, and now there's all this traffic. I used to be able to go downtown and see people. And so what's happening is that people are missing what they had left and want to have it both ways, in which they want to have a bigger house, they don't want to have traffic, they want to be able to live with people they want to live with, but they want to have the advantages of what they had from where they came from.
Well, we make your point in the book that because people are so much more mobile and because of technologies and the relative affluence, that people can now pick the lifestyle choice they want to be around. They can pick the people they want to live with. You may not like it, and it may be, the polarization of people is something that you may not agree with, but what is happening is that we are forming tribes. We can all still have a common sense of purpose and unity in the country, but there are going to be exurban tribes and empty nesting tribes and,
what's happened, I'm a Southerner, so I have a chip on my shoulders about the North, and having the Northerners having lectured us about race in the South. But if you look at Boston 50 years ago, you had the city and the metropolitan area, but you had all these little tribes living around Boston. The Italians lived over here, and these people lived over here. And what's happening in the rest of the country now is as people move, they are moving into their own little tribes. And so you can go from an inner city where either people are wealthy enough they can afford to live there or poor enough they can't afford to leave. And you go into an inner suburb area where people can afford to have a house and be close enough to the city. And then inside of that, there may be some areas that have ethnic enclaves. So you can have, all of a sudden, driving 5 miles, you can go and hit 3 or 4 different tribes, all within that small area, because people are self-selecting where they're living, much the same as what they have been doing up in New England for 200 years.
Yeah, Mary Jo, I want to come back to the religious aspects of this, because you've thought about this so much, and taking faith seriously. These megachurches do strike me as providing almost a tribal quality, where people can come, and they come not just for religious purposes, but increasingly they go there because there are restaurants, there may be a movie out, maybe basketball,
Starbucks.
there may be a Starbucks, there is a sort of community sense, but yet it's people sort of like you who may share your values.
Like Rosabeth, it seemed to me there was some kind of tension in the book. I mean, on the one hand, you talked a lot about kind of tribes and targeting and marketing and so on. On the other hand, you talked about a general sense and a general need from people for authenticity and for community. And, you know, part of what's, I think, so interesting about the megachurches and about Rick Warren's book and so on, I mean, Rick Warren's book starts off with the sentence, "This is not about you." And Rick Warren, in kind of presenting what he's doing and so on, is not figuring out what his customers want and meeting those needs, which I think is what business is kind of supposed to do, and politics is maybe not quite supposed to do, but is kind of going in that direction. But Rick Warren, you know, sees himself as answering to something larger than himself and calling people to something larger to himself and than themselves, and figuring out how to engage them in a purpose by providing ways in which they can come together and build community and so on. So there's something really encouraging about that. If you think about it, I think the danger with religion, which I think politics in some ways may be falling into, is flipping that and starting with the, well, okay, let's build the daycare centers and let's build the, you know, kind of groups and so on, and, you know, maybe we'll give a sermon or two and kind of try to bring people to something larger than themselves. So I think there's that tension in the book. I think there's that tension in the country, and I think when when Rick Warren and other religious leaders do it right, they are, you know, kind of being accountable both to their traditions and to as they would frame it, to God and God's revealed word. At the same time, they are kind of building places where people can come together in the service of that.
I just want, and I maybe I'm going to keep arguing about this. I don't think there is tension, obviously, because there's tension in society and there's a tension in the book. But there's a difference between figuring out, having some gut value that you connect with people on, giving them a sense of community and belonging and whatever that gut, empathy or tolerance or compassion or whatever that happens to be, and then figuring out the best, most efficient ways to communicate with people in America or in society, whether you're a church leader, which Rick Warren does, and all the mega church leaders do, or a political leader, Bill Clinton, George Bush, whomever else it might be. There is a fundamental sense of values and beliefs that they have, and they want to connect with people. The problem is that most politicians, to a large degree, and church leaders have adapted this quicker than that, is that the way we're associated with society, the old ways of talking to people, the old ways of communicating with them, and the old ways of doing that, whether it's the internet or whatever it happens to be, they have to update that and adapt to that, because it doesn't matter what your gut value is. It doesn't matter what you have, what your basis, what your principles are. If you haven't figured out how people associate and how people communicate, you will never reach that person to talk to them about what's in your heart.
I don't disagree with you on that. All I'm saying is that you got to have something in your heart. And you've got to have something there to stand on.
Which is the...
And then you use the techniques and so on in order to get your message across. But you can go wrong if you focus too much on the techniques without having anything, with all due respect, to say.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say, I mean, it's clear that politics is just discovering things that have been known in other institutional realms. And, you know, that's a good thing maybe because it could change the discourse. On the other hand, it could arouse its own cynicism, where people try to act as though I'm on your side, I have your values, whatever it is. And I know that targeting works because my son had done some of that targeting in a gubernatorial race where he was combing voter rolls, et cetera, et cetera. But so this isn't to say there's anything about this that necessarily doesn't refer to what's happening today, but I think it isn't so different. I just think the terms have changed, and some political leaders and parties are taking longer to catch up with the new reality, which often involves emotion and experience and not just rational product features.
But Roosevelt, this still has enormous implications. If the Republican Party clicked onto this a lot earlier than the Democratic Party, Matthew Dowd understood there's about a 7% undivided, real undecided vote, and the rest of it's a question. They changed their whole political strategy as Republicans and said, instead of going to the center, you mobilize your base and you reach people through this targeting. And they won the election by getting more people out than Democrats did. Link Chafee wins last night by, in effect, the RNC doing much the same work for him. That has enormous consequences for our politics and who has power in the country.
And so does redistricting, and so do a number of other things. The Republicans have been smart. I mean, they have figured out how to use certain things because, in part, maybe being more centralized, having thought about this, having party discipline or whatever else it is, they have figured out how to do it well.
But there's an old saying amongst political media consultants when they put ads on and it's not working anymore, they'll say they're not eating the dog food anymore. I have, to your point, a lot more faith in the American public than what you just said, in that I actually believe you can fool anybody once or twice, but over the long period of time, you don't fool anybody. And the American public is raising the bar. We call it, we're moving into an era of spine, not spin. They are raising the bar on whether you're real or not, and if you try to fool them, they will be very punitive when they figure out that you're a phony. So I don't worry one bit about introduction of some of these techniques that corporations have been doing for the last 20 years in politics. The American public generally gets it right, and I think they've proven that over time.
It may take a number of cycles.
Let me flip the question.
But I think you're right.
Let me just ask one other question before we go to the floor. Because it does seem to me that one thing that you all have asserted is we're finding in all sorts of ways in the country, and that is the degree to which Americans are becoming tribal, and they identify with the tribe, and it's and it's increasingly us, and there's the other, and the question becomes, in a democratic society like ours, how healthy it is in our politics and in our religious life that we do become tribal, and does it prevent us? Does it really stand in the way of sort of a sense of national unity, national purpose, national resolve?
Well, I think that's a great question. My fear about what's happened is that there's a combination of things that have caused this. There's some people call it confirmation bias or whatever, where people seek out information that confirms what they already believe and ignore information that disagrees with them. And when you do that over a period of time, what you believe as an opinion becomes fact, and you no longer can have an argument because you're true and they're false. What's happened is not only by how people have moved and how they have associated in tribes, but the fact that people can go to the media and they can go to a news source now that basically, to a large degree, confirms what they already believe. And whether or not you agreed with the fact that ABC, CBS, and NBC 25 years ago gave the news in sort of a general way, everybody got the news in sort of that same way. Today, you can be a Republican or somebody is part of one tribe and get information in a way that has more apt to agree with where you are, and you could be a Democrat and get information that is more apt to where you are. And then because of redistricting, you add redistricting to that. People are associated in geographic boundaries where the representatives don't reflect anybody else. They only reflect who's in that district. All that combination of things, and then we sit here and say, why can't anything get done in Washington when people then are represented by people that have had these associations? So I think that is not good for I think that is not good for our political system at all. I don't think that's good. The good news is the American public is coming to that same conclusion. And the opinion of both political parties is at a 60-year low, primarily because they feel the Republican Party only speaks to a certain element, and the Democratic Party only speaks to a certain element, and half the country or more is not part of where those loudest voices are saying. And I think what that means is the public's going to sit there, and they're going to sit there and say, I'm sick of this, I'm sick of this, I'm sick of this. These November elections are a perfect example. The November Democrats are probably going to end up winning more races than the Republicans in picking up seats. Not because the American public says, boy, do I love what the Democratic Party is offering. I love their message. They got a great vision. It's because the Republicans are in power. They're so sick of what's going on in Washington, they're going to vote people out because they're tired of it all. And I think I trust, as Doug says, I trust the American public. This polarization that's happened and how people live and their patterns of information isn't a good thing, but the public's going to sort of get to the point where both political parties don't represent the majority of the country.
Then what happens?
I want to pick up on that, and also Doug's point earlier about how the public will get it right because they care about authenticity. These same tools, and by the way, just because I'm at the business school doesn't mean I love everything companies do and marketing techniques and so forth. But the same technology that allows this kind of targeting and maybe even some manipulation is the kind of technology that also exposes inauthenticity very quickly, and the word spreads. So some of the same forces that we see as negative also have another side and can help bring us back. Secondly, there are some ways in which we can reunite the country, and one is young people are very interested and motivated in community service, and we can create institutions that bring people across the divides, because while people may disagree about the root causes of problems, they care about saving this particular child in this particular school regardless of their party, and that is one thing that unites us and is part of an American tradition.
I agree with that. I think there's really good news over the long term. It's probably bad news in that people up here, we're not going to be alive when it happens. But the 9/11.
Speak for yourself.
Well, let me make my point, and we'll figure out how old you're going to be. But what we call the 9/11 generation, which if I look out there, I see some. I don't see any up here.
There you go again.
They're not tribal. I mean, you look at young people and their tolerance on social lifestyles and interracial marriage. I mean, they're all liberals or anything, but they are a different ilk than the baby boomers and the greatest generation. And they are almost anti-tribal. And we believe, and we talk about it in the book, that they have more in common with the quote-unquote greatest generation that Brokaw wrote about than they do with the baby boomers. In a way, if you take a step back and look over 100 years, I think the baby boomers, we're the odd guys out. We're the ones that aren't in step. The 9/11 generation may express themselves differently than their grandparents in terms of religion and how they practice it, politics and how they show their political expression, civic involvement. But they're much more engaged and much more likely to be the next greatest generation than the baby boomers are. And they are not going to put up with this kind of divisiveness and tribal pettiness and trying to divide people. And so over the long term, that's going to be a great thing for our country.
Rachel, and if you'd like to ask a question, and you sort of got your hand up, there are microphones here on either side. There are two more here. We have a tradition here of going from starting here and going here. We will come around to the questions. Please be brief. And as our former Dean Joe Nye liked to remind us when we were here, please remember that every question ends with a question mark. So maybe we ought to go directly. I wanted to ask you one more question, but let's go directly to the questions. There's a microphone, and I don't know who's first. You all are getting very tribal over there. One of you ought to go.
We're a unified tribe.
You're a unified tribe. Then, all right, can we have one question from you? Yes, ma'am. Please, go ahead. Identify yourself and fire away.
My name is Paloma Zepeda. I was wondering if you could talk more about how this 9/11 generation might need to reshape the political institutions that, for better or for worse, were shaped by this generation, the baby boomers.
First, I want to thank Paloma for helping us so much on the book. She was one of our best researchers. And Doug, why don't you take that, please?
Well, I don't think they're going to reshape it. I think they're going to blow it up and create new systems. You know, it's easier to build a house than it is to renovate it. And part of the transition that's going on in our country is the failure of institutions to take care of the people that they're supposed to serve. Whether it's your pals in the business world, who what they've done on Wall Street in the last 10 years. You think about the Catholic Church and other religions that have failed. You think about sports. These guys are all juiced up on steroids. You think about newspapers that have had to recant stories that have been false. The political system has failed. And Katrina is the sort of gold medal of proof for everyone that our government is incompetent of serving the people. And so increasingly what people have been forced to do, and the internet is really empowering people now, is to create their own communities, create their own institutions to solve these problems, because they know that these kind of World War II era and before institutions are broken and don't work, and it's easier to start afresh than it is from trying to fix these problems that have basically been non-responsive to people's needs.
Well, how do you fix it, though? How do you fix if you
talk
about
use Katrina. Use Katrina as an example, where the president flew over on his way from his ranch to a fundraiser or whatever, and the Red Cross spent a week figuring out what they were going to do about it, and then they figured out some trailers, whatever. What people just empowered themselves. We have some stories in the book where people got on the phone and they found people that had a relative that needed somewhere to get out, and somebody from California gave them Southwest airline tickets to be able to fly them there, and someone else knew someone in a house in Detroit where they could live. And people responded to Katrina in their own time, in their own way, because they knew they couldn't count on anybody to do it for them. And so the internet really is empowering people to cluster based on their interests and based on needs and problems, and be able to create these institutions. Some of them are virtual and some of them are real. But pretty much, if you take an old institution, it's increasingly likely that it's not really built and in step for the problems and challenges of the future.
Okay. Please.
Good evening, and thank you for your time. My name is Pablo Quintanilla. I'm a second-year student at the Kennedy School, and I want to say that I haven't read the book. The term tribal has been used numerous times tonight, and I'm wondering what the rationale is for choosing that term.
Well, we're looking for a term that would describe what is happening out there with people. As Doug was mentioning now, they're so empowered where they can take over institutions. They're empowered where they can create their own journalism. They're empowered they can build their own CDs on their iPods. They're also empowered that they can decide where they're going to live, and who they're going to live around, and who they're going to turn to for advice. So you have this self-polarization of people, and politically, they can break one way or another in mass, and that's what happened in Virginia. In 2004, George Bush won 7 of the fastest-growing counties in Virginia by 13 percentage points altogether. 1 year later, politics hadn't changed very much. A Democrat, Tim Kaine, fought in those 7 districts to a tie of 7 counties and won 4 of those counties outright because he spoke to the same people, spoke to their values, and this tribe of ex-urbanites moved from Republican to Democrat. So it was a way of trying to come up with a synonym for a gathering of people who can move in mass, literally moving to a different neighborhood, or moving politically, or moving from Walmart to Target because of a value.
That's very interesting. I was just recalling how when the evangelical Christians really became a force in politics, first time was 1976, and they voted for Jimmy Carter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep.
And then they voted for Ronald Reagan.
Yep. And not because of any policy.
Well, they both appealed to their values.
Exactly.
Yeah. Please.
Hi, my name is Sanjay Savanason. I'm an incoming freshman at the college. And my question is, going back to what Mr. Zosnick was talking about, we're ushering a new era of spine, not spin. So, and you talk about how Hillary Clinton specifically, she needs to show that she disagrees and use that as a badge of honor, sort of. But then how can you also find some sort of connection with the people? Because those seem to be two conflicting views.
Well, I'm gonna answer first. The interesting thing about elections, presidential elections, is they're always based in values. Everybody says, well, was this an issue election or was this a personality election? Presidential elections are never about issues or personality. Personality and issues reflect and point to and indicate a broader value that the American public cares about. Different elections have different hierarchy of values that the American public cares about and needs at that time. In 1992, the most important value that if you looked at all this stuff was cares about you and understands what you're going through. And so you had Bill Clinton, who is a politician and a leader that reflected that value. You fast forward to 2000, 2004, the most important value wasn't cares about you or understands what you're going through. The most important value in the 2004 election, because of economic anxiety and because of terrorism and international anxiety, global economy, all those sorts of things, people were unsettled. They wanted somebody that, no matter if I agree with you or not, was a strong and decisive leader. That could, in a time of change, a time of great change, I know I can count on them.
And going back to your point, in 76, it was integrity, which is why that's
so you look forward to 2008. I don't exactly know today exactly that value. The American public says, in my president, I need this. because we're in this serious time and this is going on. And I don't think Hillary Clinton can say, okay, it's going to be this value. I'm going to go ahead and fix that, and this is who I am. The values, the American public knows the value. They can get it in their gut. They can see it reflected in the person. They know that. And I think, what Hillary Clinton does, whether she cares about you or whatever those things happen to be, I think she has to be, I think part of the problem, with politicians that follow the Dick Morris strategy, honestly, that basically can think, okay, and for this group of people I'm going to be this, and for this group of people I'm going to be this, and for this group of people I'm going to be this. It doesn't work. It really doesn't work, because people figure it out. People know who you are, and you can't just make up a value that you don't have credible, that's not you, that's not reflected in you, that's not comes out of you. So I don't know in 2008 exactly what that value the American public's going to want in a president because of what's going on at the time. But I think that, whether or not Hillary...
What is it right now? If their vote were today, what would it be?
Authenticity and community. Authenticity, give people a sense of belonging. I think. What do you think?
I actually think one of the things the American public wants today is that it's not like a manager, but they want somebody that basically says, let's make the stuff work that doesn't work. Iraq got out of control, and we were told this, and we're bogged down over there. The government doesn't work. Katrina's all messed up. We can't do anything. Who's going to be the person that we feel can make it work again? To make things work again. And I think whether we dislike the institution or not, the American public counts on these institutions. And I think that the Bush value reflected in strong and decisive leaders, though they always want somebody strong and decisive, I think they're so sick of everything. Just every time they turn somewhere, they get disappointed in it. They want some assurance that when they go somewhere, the television's not going to break, or government's going to be able to, they'll get their check, or whatever it happens to be. So authenticity, I think, is important, and community is important. But in an election in the aftermath of Iraq and a failure of the government institutions, I think people are going to be looking for somebody that can say, can you make this work?
Accountability.
Yeah.
Right.
Interesting. Yeah, please.
Definitely.
Hi, my name's Carrie Ann Gady. I'm a mid-career student at the school. And my question's about the targeting techniques during the campaign. How do people feel when they find out that politicians have that much data about their lifestyle choices? Does it bother them? Do they even know about it? Or do they trust you more because you've kind of taken the time to get to know them, I guess?
I was wondering about that. That's a good question. I like
well, I think the American public, they get somebody all of a sudden gets some crazy magazine. It's like, why did I get this magazine? And then they got a piece of mail on some product or something. It's based off a list or something like that. I mean, I don't think the American public sits there and says, how does this person get my name or something? I do think they think it's a value that what this has provided is an ability, and what it actually really provided was an efficient way to do grassroots that had not been done before in a presidential campaign. Most presidential campaigns had been driven by mass marketing advertising. This was the first time. We spent more money in this presidential campaign on grassroots and outreach, whether it's sending a piece of direct mail, sending people to knock on a door that lived in a neighborhood. And I think the American public, which is one of the reasons why I think they responded better to some of the things we did in that, because you could take a piece of mail and you could take a piece of literature there. But less and less money was spent in this presidential campaign on mass advertising, and I think that's better. I think that in the end is a better thing, and it's because you can't go and talk to 200 million Americans, but if you can figure out how to talk to 10 million Americans or 12 million or 20 million Americans, you can do that in person, or better in person.
I can tell you about two specific women who I interviewed at Applebee's in Howell, Michigan, and they said, I don't ask them what party. I can't really describe myself politically, but they both agreed in gay rights but didn't think it should be a political issue. They're both opposed to abortion but didn't think it was a political issue. Both were union members, both were blue collar, both came from Democratic backgrounds. They didn't really like the president's policies, but were likely going to vote for him. Terrorism really scared the bejeebies out of these two women. So about 6 months later, as I'm wrapping up the book, I call one of the Bush people and say, I have these two women's names. They live in Howell, Michigan. Can you look them up and tell me what group they're in? And the guy tells me, well, they're one of 101,643 terrorism moderates. And those terrorism moderates in Michigan tend to be union members, tend to be people who would vote for Kerry unless we touch them with the right message. And that message is, the president will make you safer. When I told her this, she said, wow, do they have all that information on me? when I explained to her, it's your credit cards, and she said, that's kind of scary. She said, but where do I fit in? I said, well, you're on the list of all the categories, of 34 categories. Not quite as conservative as all the conservative groups, and not as liberal as the liberal clusters. And she said, oh, they pegged me. That's about right.
It's astonishing, though, how much information. I mean, they had 1,200 categories. Is that what you guys said?
Well, they have
South?
several, almost 200 types of lifestyle flags. Category like you're boating or you would like to do needlepoint, different characteristics like that. But in every state there is 35, 36 different categories you would be lumped into. And literally, if you're in one of the swing districts, you're literally on their list, and you're one of a very specific number of people in that cluster.
But let me just correct one thing that I think people have assumed about this. That the assumption is made in presidential campaigns, the most successful campaigns figure out broad messages and broad values that they then communicate in the most efficient, isolated, targeted way possible. And what I think what happened is, I think the difference between my fundamental huge difference between the Kerry campaign to a large degree and the Bush campaign is we took a broad message and a broad value, and we said it in thousands of different ways. We brought certain cable shows and we said the same. We explained the same broad value in the broad messaging. The Kerry campaign took a lot of little messages and said it broadly, and said it instead of taking one big message and figure out spokes from a wheel how to say it in 122 different ways and communicate it. They took a bunch of little messages and said it in a huge big way, and that's I think one of the biggest differences between the two campaigns.
Yes, sir.
I'm Jonathan Steinman from a freshman at Harvard College. I was wondering if you could comment on the differences in marketing a candidate to an audience that votes once every year, 2 years, 4 years, and marketing to people who eat at Applebee's weekly or monthly, people who buy at Walmart weekly, people who need to repeat. I mean, you don't repeat.
People who go to church once a week versus those who go once a year.
I was wondering how you differentiate your strategies, how you can draw parallels, and what parallels don't exist.
Well, I think the first thing is politics. The people that think that politics is all about like one decision on election day, and that's the decision. I think the best political campaigns and the best messaging from politics understands it's a book with many, many chapters that people reach a conclusion at the end of that book. Chapter 1 could be some incident that happens. Chapter 2 could be a debate. Chapter 3 could be a convention. Chapter 4 could be something. And if that thematic and if you understand it that way, and if I think you watch some of the things we did, in all the instances that we did things, we were trying to do it that we might not give people a conclusion today, tomorrow, whatever, but by that long path that we took, and how we talked about Kerry or how we talked about Bush, every day or every week in a different instance, in a different way, to ultimately, by the time people voted, they came to a conclusion that would be more apt in our favor than their favor. And I think actually politics is becoming more and more, to a large degree, like business, where it's not just about election day, it's about 2 years, it's about 3 years, and how do you build brand? How do you build your brand so that when people make the decision that they go have to make a product choice, that your brand is better than the other person's brand? And I think many times campaigns get off into the thing, okay, we got an election, and this is what we're going to do, and we're going to put everything in 6 weeks, and that's how we're going to do it, and we don't have to worry about that, we're going to do that. And so somebody else can talk to the business, but it's a much longer-term brand idea in politics than I think people assume it is.
I mean, another way to kind of frame that same question is you have to think about what it takes to get people to do something once and what it takes to get people to do something again, and then to do it again after that and again after that. I mean, if you're marketing your church, you want to get people there, but that you have to be able to get them back, and so presumably for business and religion, delivering on the product, if you will, is the most important thing in kind of keeping up the marketing, and you might want to speak to that.
Well, I think part of the thing is, and one of the things that we worried about, and business has done some of this lately, is this whole idea of your promoter index or your promoter score. And part of what you have to do in politics is to figure out that long before election day, you want people next door neighbor reconfirming somebody's choice or reconfirming somebody's decision long before they get to election day. 90% of people in this country make up the decision who they're going to vote for long before election day. Long before election day, they've come to a conclusion, they got there, and then election day happens. And so part of what you do in politics is to figure out how you communicate that so that somebody's next door neighbor will go out and say, hey, did you hear this thing about Bush, or did you hear this thing about Kerry, to their next door neighbor, so they promote that person over time. And if something happens in the midst of the campaign, they're more apt if you make a mistake, something happens, you do poorly at a Miami debate, for instance. Not to pull something totally out of thin air. But you have people that have built up the brand and are willing to promote your person just like a product. Just like saying, why don't you go down buy this cell phone, or why don't you go do this? There's a way to affect how people promote in their communities.
But it also works better if the cell phone works.
Yes.
Getting people to
well,
the
interesting thing about this discussion is building a brand in politics at a gut level with people, extremely important, basically is decisive. But politicians can lose that gut value and gut connection with the American public. And once they lose that gut value and gut, you cannot get it back through 5 speeches. And you can't get it back through a new RNC strategy. And that's the thing. It's like all the marketing and all that, it's all very important and all that. Once you lose a gut value with the American public, you can't hold 3 press conferences and fix it. You can't do all that.
What gut value has been lost?
Well, I think, part of the things we mentioned in the book, if you talk about the current president had, up until the summer of 2005, the American public had a sense, I may disagree with that, Iraq's a mess, and I feel bad about the economy, but, I know he's there, and I know I can trust him, and I know he's going to be doing the right thing, and I can count on him, he's a strong and decisive leader. Through the course of that summer, and you look at what all happened in that course of that summer, which was that the number of deaths in Iraq rose. The president was on vacation or at the Western White House, as we describe it, in August. Cindy Sheehan is there protesting the war. He can't meet with Cindy Sheehan, but he can meet and swim with Lance Armstrong and talk about his heart rate. And all of that happens, and the gas prices spike. And so the American public's sitting there saying, all this is going on, the president seems disconnected, and he doesn't seem to be, I don't know if I trust him, I'm starting to get this bad feeling in my gut about this, and I don't know about this. And then all of a sudden, bam, Katrina. And so they were getting a sense of this, and Katrina was like, okay, I was right, I don't like this, what's going on, he's not the guy I thought he was. And as soon as that happened, you look at the poll numbers and look at everything, his job approval drops, how people view the Iraq war, everything fell. And it will not, in my view, get back to pre-level unless another crisis, unless something else emerges where the American public can see in a big, big way a reconnection that they have. Because, as I said, once you can't market your way back to a gut value.
Hi, my name is Max Anderson. I'm a student at the Kennedy School. Thanks for coming. My question is less about the politics, although there's application to it, and more about community creation in general. And it's related to your view of the internet and internet technologies, peer-to-peer production, social networking. MySpace and Facebook are among the 10 most visited sites on the internet. And it seemed from your comments to so far this evening, they've been looking at the internet as a source of positive source of community building, but also a place where people can form their tribes because they're getting news instead of from broadcast news from their own selected source. But I feel like there's at least a tension because the internet could be a source for community, but what kind of community is it when people are spending so much time alone as opposed to face-to-face? And secondly, in terms of instead of getting broadcast journalism, people at least are getting a variety of viewpoints. They might only go to the Democratic blogs or the Republican blogs, or they might go to both. Just like to hear your comments on those issues.
Well, the reason I enjoyed politics so much and really enjoyed covering Governor and Bill Clinton and President Clinton was that politics isn't black and white. It's all about the grays. And life is all about the grays. There's tension in society, especially when society is going through a once-in-a-century transformation, which we are right now. So yes, it's certainly the internet is a tool that a lot of people are using to connect both offline and online. I met with the co-founder this week of Meetup.com. It's incredible what they're doing to bring people together offline. Now, sure, they're building little tribes of people who like food and little tribes of people who like to play euchre and little tribes of people who think they're witches. But they're bringing people together. That's a good thing. And yes, there are people who are spending too much time, like my daughter, on IM and not, communicating with people face to face. And the technology has been a divisive force in this country. But we do think, over time, especially as this generation comes into its own right, that it's going to be seen as more of a uniter than a divider.
Interesting. We're running out of time. We'll try to take a couple more. Yes.
Hi, my name is John Gould. I'm a freshman at the college. My question is about micro-targeting, not in who the consumer is, which is what we've talked about a lot, but as to who the salesperson is. That in terms of either building party, building community, or building support for a specific candidate, has any work been done into who the best salesman is? Should it be coming from the candidate or the party or a union leader or a church leader? Has any work been done into that, either in bringing voters in for the base or in persuading swing voters?
Yeah, that's actually a good question, because one of the things about micro-targeting or life targeting or whatever, if you sort of associate people in groups, what they care about, what motivates them, different people motivate different people in different ways and in different communities and different cities. We explored a lot of that, and I think, as you saw, a lot of this was intuition before, but now is much more of a science. What person you send as a surrogate somewhere, who you put on a news station in St. Louis or in Kansas City or in Portland, Oregon, to talk about your policies versus somebody else. The type of local leader that you want to recruit in a given community to be the face, to be the voice of your party or your campaign should be reflected, in my view. If you're going to have an effective message and you're going to get as many people to hear that as possible, you ought to have the person that is more apt to be heard. And so, yeah, a lot of that in previous campaigns was more intuitive. We did a lot of things about finding out sort of who were those right people, what were the right people to send somewhere, and it didn't always have to be the president or the vice president or somebody else. Presidential campaigns are a little different. I think this could actually have much more profound effect on local races or more localized races in a race that basically everybody sees and hears broadly, but it still had an effect about surrogates and all that.
I think the internet has democratized politics, and it's also democratized business. I used to get a lot better deals before than I can now because I used to know how to do it. Now everything is transparent. Everyone can go on the internet. Everyone can find out what a car costs. Everybody can figure out the cheapest way to buy an airline ticket. 20 years ago, when there wasn't an internet, I knew how to still do that. Other people didn't. And so it's been democratized, but it's also democratized our politics. And we're much more in our politics now like we were 75 and 80 years ago before television in terms of a bottom-up grassroots movement. And I think one of the things we've failed to be clear about tonight is the real power, you can talk about technology and going into people's business, the most important thing to do is get all this information. But then what you want to do is get friends, family, neighbors, and coworkers who are respected in the community, who people knew before the election are going to know after the election, and arm them to go to their friends and neighbors with the information that you've culled and have them make the case of why they're supporting our candidate. And so it's a combination of things, but the data is power, but at the end of the day, it's just a means to an end. And the end, I believe, going forward politically is going to be the power of the bottom-up, neighbor-to-neighbor, community leaders who aren't defined the way we used to define them 20 years ago in politics. We used to say 20 years ago the head of the Young Dems, or there was all these institutions that have like 30 people in a meeting. 20 years ago in politics, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Our country, you could drink and drive and kill someone, they might give you a $500 fine, or if they're really angry, they might take your license for 6 months. And finally, this woman, Lightman, whose daughter died in a car wreck, she got so outraged by that she created her own community of people that force political change on how you view drinking and driving in this country. Well, she became a real community leader. This is long before the internet. You have all these organizations now that are being created through the internet of people that are congregating in these little tribes in which they are friends with each other. And inside of that, we were doing an interview the other day, and the interviewer said, yeah, he says, like, we have a jury. Somehow the jury room figures out who the foreman is, just self-selects it. But so it's taking this information and using these people in the communities who are these new leaders, whether they're the guidance counselor in high school, the soccer coach, and those are the people that are going to make the sale. Because those are people that in the community that are leaders and are trustworthy.
The navigators, yeah. Rosemary.
This is that's wonderful because that's bringing us full circle to where we were before the industrial era in America. This is de Tocqueville democracy in America.
Yep.
If you go and read his tour of America, he doesn't talk about the federal government. He talks about our tendency to organize on a local level, and anybody can get things done. And that's really important. We have more tools now for that kind of empowerment. I think that's phenomenal. Social entrepreneurs, social innovation, change the world.
That's great, but you can't fix the healthcare system that way.
Yeah.
And
No,
you can't
but you-
stop climate change that way,
Well-
and you can't win in Iraq that way. You do need some central institutions
Well, we're
that
gonna
work.
But you
you can take
can
over those
recruit
Yeah.
better people who are willing to run for office because they've been seasoned leaders in
That I
their
agree.
community.
Yeah.
And that will restore
Yeah, and-
trust
or
in
you can,
government.
or you can do it
Okay.
to a president whose policies are counter to that.
I agree with that. Listen, we're going to end this here in a second because those of you who are still standing, there's going to be a reception tonight with the co-authors over here in the IOP conference room, and you're invited over there if you have additional questions. It's a fascinating group.
And if you have a book, we'll be happy to sign it.
And yeah.
If you don't, we'll be happy to sell it.
Yeah, we'll
And
sell it.
so there'll be a chance for that. You have the last question. I've got one tiny one right there with you.
Thanks, sir. I'll make it quick. My name is Jason. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. There's been quite a bit of talk about buzzwords like grassroots and bottom-up. And while we're talking about all that, I hear a lot about micro-targeting and spending a whole bunch of money to get to know every single person, which seems to me the antithesis of bottom-up. And I certainly don't mean to attack the strategy that obviously worked in 2000, but over $200 million for President Bush. Mayor Michael Bloomberg in New York spent, by all accounts, over $100 million to get himself reelected doing micro-targeting. My question is, or maybe I'm just asking you to expound a little bit, what role does money have because in this grassroots idea, because the more you can spend unlimited money finding out unlimited things about unlimited people in the United States, and I keep that concept in opposition to real grassroots, which is free or close to free, like blogging on the internet. And so
Before
how do
someone
you...
here answers that question better than I am, I'm going to recommend that this week you sit down with Karen Hicks, one of the best organizers in the Democratic Party, and ask her what she could have done with the information that this technology developed if she was able to pinpoint the navigators in the neighborhoods and have the house parties in the right houses. These are tools for the old. You know what the original navigators were in this country? It was a person who met my great-grandparent at the dock and said, you know what? I'm going to help you find a place to live. I'm going to help you find a job. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to show your kids where to go to school. And then 6 months later, I'm going to come back and tell you to be a Democrat. What this technology is doing is empowering the old way of politics.
Well, I'm going to answer your question. The interesting thing is, as this goes forward, money is going to become less important in politics and more important. And the reason why the biggest driver of political expenditures is not micro-targeting, and it's not how do we organize grassroots. The biggest driver was television advertising. And as people realize more and more that the ability to communicate a message on television drops in effectiveness, which it is, that means the cost of political campaigns is going to drop, and people are going to invest more and more and more money into just what you're talking about. To me, that's a good thing. Now, whether or not you agree with exactly micro-targeting, if the whole idea of this gets people to basically engage somebody in some small community and recruit them and get them involved that they have not been involved before, whether it's through the internet, so that they don't watch 10 television advertisements that don't tell them much anymore, I would much rather have that system. That's where we're headed. And the internet, because it's free, because you can communicate with 1,000 people like that and send out a note or send out whatever you can, I think over time that the cost of campaigns and the ability for somebody just overwhelmed with television advertising, as we saw in this campaign, we tested it, the effectiveness of television advertising is low. It's extremely low.
We're happy about that.
I agree with the conclusion, but even if it doesn't, in terms of the cost, I think the role of money in politics is exaggerated greatly. I mean, if you do need, say $10 million to be able to put a presidential campaign together. Well, hell, if a guy can't raise $10 million, or a woman, they can't raise $10 million to run for president, I don't want them to be our president. I mean, if they can't figure out how to raise $10 million, they're not up to running our country. But 35% of the people who gave money to John Kerry were never asked. You can communicate instantaneously now, people. If you motivate people based on who you are and where you want to lead the country, the money will be there overnight. That's far more important than just having money. But you do need money to get. Money is like an ante. That's the cost of being able to participate. Being authentic and being a real person. That's the point of entry to be able for someone to vote for you. That doesn't mean they're going to vote for you because you're authentic. But if you're inauthentic, then nothing else behind that's going to matter. Eventually, they're not going to vote for you. So I don't worry about money. I don't worry about the role of money in politics. It's less and less important. It's far more important that you're able to communicate who you are and where you want to lead the country if it's running for president, and the money will be there.
Good. Matthew, let me ask you one last question. Because you're the person who really spotted the fact that the center had shrunk in American politics, and people voted very consistently one side or the other. And the center was down to 7%, persuaded Karl Rove of that, and it really led to a major shift in the political strategy for political campaign. No longer did the candidate run to the center to pick up the undecideds. The candidate ran in a way to mobilize the base. And that's sort of been defining the way people now run. You said something very interesting tonight, and that is there are a lot of people who are disconnected on either side of that 7% or are discontented on either side, and they may break away. And I'm trying to figure out what are the implications of that. How large a group is, and what are the implications?
Well, I think it's a great question because I've presented this data and showed that the fact that basically the American public was lining up, they'd figure out whose team they were on, whether they had an R on their back or a D on their back, and then vote that way, basically consistent down the ballot, whether it was for president, governor, senator, Congress, whatever it happens to be. Once they got that D on their back or once they got that R on their back. The interesting thing, as I said before, is they didn't necessarily get that R and their D on their back because of an issue. They got the R and the D on their back because their next door neighbor, they seemed to like them, they were there, okay, he's this, I got two Republicans here, I must be a Republican, and I'm going to go vote that way, and that's what I'm going to do because I'm part of that team. What's interesting about it is the majority of people, when you take issue sets among those two groups, the 47-47 or whatever it happens to be, and start saying how people understand Republicans to be, small government, low tax, conservative on social issues, that group only represents 25 or 24% of the population of this country. And you take a look at larger government, more services, more liberal or moderate on social issues, and maybe higher taxes, they only represent about 23 or 24% of people in this country. So there's a whole bunch of Republicans that are big government Republicans. There's a whole bunch of Democrats that are conservative on social issues. They've picked a team unrelated to issues, and now they're sitting there and watching politics as it engages today, when the only thing they hear are people that speak to 23% and people that speak to 24 or 25%. Everything they hear on cable is food going back and course across it. One Republican represents just 24.5%, one Democrat. So 50% of people in the country, whether they're somebody with an R on their back or a D on their back, thinks these people don't represent me. They're saying all this stuff, and I don't necessarily agree with it. And so I think this idea that we're in for a long struggle for 50-50 elections, I think is false. I think that if a candidate emerges or somebody emerges that understands, that connects with the American public, this is not a shift that's going to be, okay, we're now a 52% country. This could be a shift that means we're a 58% country. If somebody speaks to people and connects with people at a value and does that. But, so I think when I explain that, and then many Republican strategists have gone out and said, okay, that's what we need to do. We're going to go talk to the base. We're going to talk about low taxes. We're going to talk about, abortion. We're going to talk about this. They're only talking to 25% of the people in this country. And they're going to lose many elections if that's the only thing they do.
I agree with Matt's conclusion. I think I might get there a little bit differently. I believe in the pendulum, and I believe we are going to fix the health care system in our country. I don't know when, And the reason I believe that is, at some point, it's going to be so screwed up, we can't afford not to. And I think this country is exhausted in this debate that we've been having basically since Bill Clinton became president. We've had one long food fight since January of '93 until now. And they're tired of the arguments. They're tired of the people who've been arguing. They would like to get rid of all of them and start over again. And so I believe that, at least we think 35% roughly. There are most people don't sit around on a Wednesday night at 8 o'clock sitting around talking about politics. I mean, they're just kind of living their life. And there's, a third of the people out there right now who are completely wide open. And we were talking about this the other day. If you look at the polling data and anecdotal evidence, I think you'll find that if the candidates of the Democratic Party and Republican Party aren't responsive and aren't willing to turn the page in terms of where we're going in this country in the debate, it's going to leave it wide open for a third party to come in. People they want new. They want different. They're tired of all of this. And so I think we're at this point, that's part of, again, back to our book, there are these things individually that have happened in the last 20 years that are really significant. But what's phenomenal is they're all happening on top of each other. And that's why it makes it such a once-in-a-century moment that we're in right now of change. And we are politically getting ready to move to a whole new era in politics. I have no idea what that is, but I'm telling you, if the political class doesn't respond to that and thinks what we've been doing for the last 14 years is going to work in the future, we're going to end up with new parties.
And maybe put one more thing, what's going to add emphasis to that, which is why this opening, where the public, is the November elections this year. What is likely to happen is the country's going to turn around on November 8th, and the country's going to even look more divided, and Washington look more out of sync, and the Democrats could take the House back. They could take it barely. It'll be a very close election. The Senate will be barely decided one way or the other, likely retained barely by the Republicans, barely. We'll have a president, 40% job approval rating in the aftermath of November 7th. American public's going to wake up, and you know what they're going to say? They're going to say, oh, we're going to have 2 more years, and it's going to be worse than the last 2 years.
And I'll just say 2 things on that. One is, nothing's going to get done in Washington in the next 2 years. You've got a lame duck president. You're going to have one party's control one body by 2 votes, and one's not by 2 votes. You're going to have a big presidential debate coming up. And last thing I'll say, I think I'll just do a quick Bush drive-by shooting, if you don't mind. It's in fairness to Bush, it's got 2 more years, and maybe something will happen, and history will treat him differently. Who knows? I think, though, he will go down in history as a president who never once tried to bring this country together. And he had 4 or 5 moments to do that. He as we used to say about Al Gore, he didn't win the election, he just came in first. But Bush came in with 500,000 fewer votes, made no effort to bring this country together when he became president. Even Nixon in '69 went after the Wallace vote to try to at least consolidate a majority of the people in this country. After 9/11,
When you start a sentence with even Nixon, you know it's going to be a drive-by.
You're okay about that? You're okay about that, David, right? Okay. After 9/11, he didn't ask the country to do anything except shop. He got reelected president in 2004. He made no effort to bring the country together in the second term. And Monday night, the 5th anniversary of 9/11, he uses that as an opportunity to talk about his political strategy in Iraq. So I believe what history will look back on at this president, it's not that he failed to bring the country together, it's that he didn't try to bring the country together. And for every action, you have a reaction. And so as you think about the next president, the one thing we know for sure is it's going to be they want change. What that kind of change is, we don't know. But one thing we do know, which is the theory of our book here, the thesis, is that this country wants to be part of something larger than themselves. And you look to your president to be the person that leads the country in doing that. And the person who can do that in an authentic way is the person who's going to be our next president.
I agree. I agree with the conclusion.
We can only stop there because this will be part of a continuing conversation here in the forum. Gene Sheen is going to, with this forum, will have a vibrant set of programs with Bill White and others over the year on politics. So we'll stop knowing that there will be somebody here to speak up for the president and talk about it, and agree also with Matthew Dowd. But I think we should join it. Mary Jo and Matt and Ron and Roosevelt and Doug all of us are in your debt. This is a really interesting evening. Thank you for writing the book. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.